Well, welcome into Downtown Mission Church Stevens Point. It stands for Ask, Seek, Knock. It is our opinion as Christian pastors that we don't have a little bit of a vested interest in the game, but we do want you to know that we seek to engage with people's questions, and we seek to engage thoughtfully. So we have provided a live chat option. We have one of our staff members at the church who is monitoring that live chat. So if you have questions, if you're hanging out at home, we would love for you to interact with us in that way. We might even ask you for a follow-up question, just so we can get a little bit into the heart of what you're asking and why you're asking, and hopefully we can provide thoughtful answers. So throughout the course of the night, you may see me ask off camera if we have any questions, and then you may hear me repeat a question, and that is just as we're communicating with the live chat function, and we welcome any and all questions for a respectful dialogue. And as far as kind of more of what we're doing here tonight, Chris?
Yeah, so as far as what we're aiming to do, one of, I think, the criticisms that's been leveled at the Christian church, or probably the past 60 years or so, has been a criticism that Christianity does not, a lot of times people will view Christianity as simply an emotional, and we deeply love the truth that we find in Scripture, that we find in the Word of God, and so it is our vested interest to answer questions from that perspective. So what we're wanting to do this evening is to, again, as Pastor Josh said, facilitate dialogue. We would love to have not only an initial question, but we'd love to have a follow-up question as well. If maybe you feel like we took the easy way out, or if you feel like maybe there's something that is not satisfying in our response, we don't want to have all caps, we don't want exclamation points, any kind of a trolling war or anything like that, but we really, really would like to engage, because especially in this season right now where it's so difficult for people to be together and to get together and have coffee shop conversations, we want to create an environment that we can provide what we hope is a great resource to anybody who might be asking questions that they aren't finding answers to because they're not around people, they might feel uncomfortable, and honestly, anonymity is something that can be kind of a nice place to be when you're asking harder questions about life. So we would terribly, terribly, terribly hate to see any opportunities missed. So please, by all means, fire off your questions. Let us know. Again, one of our staff members is going to be facilitating those questions here, and that's where we're going tonight.
Yeah. Be a Christian or even a religious person as a whole, you really need to check your brain at the door. As soon as you walk in the church, leave your brain behind. And so not only maybe is Christianity viewed as breaking apart. So could you, this is a loaded question, but just as we start off tonight, could you describe the relationship between rational thinking and
the history of world religions? There is, I think, a pretty fair, if somebody is coming from what we call the secular perspective, who would say naturalism, a materialistic worldview, all that we can see is all that there really is. There, I think, would be a lot of times people, if you think about you think about what Buddhism is, and the whole idea of emptying oneself of consciousness in order to find a place where you are at bliss and nirvana, where you've completely checked out. I mean, that's really kind of what it comes down to put it in layman's terms. And when you think about things like tantric Hinduism, the idea of kind of whipping oneself into an emotional frenzy, these are things that I think a lot of secular individuals will see in religion and spirituality, and then how it transfers into the Christian church is there are sects, we'll call them, within the Christian church that also practice these same types of things. And so I think for the secular person who might be watching, who might be asking these questions of, I went to college, I have this degree, that degree, whatever, thinking, I just don't see a space in spirituality to think. I guess I would push back and see, from the Christian perspective, what is the real Christian perspective on it? So how does the life of the mind, how does faith, how do these two things kind of join together? And something that I'm drawn to when I think, I guess pun intended, when I think about this question, this topic, is when Jesus' mind and strength. And so these different aspects of the human person are all supposed to be engaged in the process of worshiping God. So when it comes to the life of the mind, Jesus is very clear, and going all the way back to the Old Testament, the idea of thinking is a core value of Judeo-Christian theology, Judeo-Christian religion. So for us, I would say it's built in to how we're supposed to worship God. So I would say to anybody, people, the idea of miracles seem incompatible to a naturalistic worldview. But I would caution somebody to say, just because it doesn't seem compatible with a worldview, with a perspective. So does that help?
Yeah. So what I'm grabbing out of there is one, the Christian Holy Book tells you enough that Christianity is incredibly compelling, and so we want to be a church. We want to be a group of people that invite deep thinking, both within our church and with people who are not in our. I talked to a Christian that wasn't just kind of crazy and yelling at me. So before we check the live chat, Justin, I'm put you on the spot here because I didn't tell you to prepare for this, but maybe one of the stereotypes that Christians get is with the blind faith, you just believe what you were grown up in, is I think oftentimes we don't do enough to talk about things that we've doubted within the Christian faith and times we've struggled to believe core tenets of the faith. Do you have an example of maybe when you reach those formative years, hit college or young adulthood, where you really wrestled with whether or not to believe what you now do for a living?
Sure. I think in a general sense, every time that hardship has hit, the seeds of doubt creep in very easily. I think that's why, one question that gets posed so often is how can God be good and there can be this misery and this evil in the world? How can God be good and there is death surrounded, that there's a pandemic happening in 2020, those kind of questions. Because it's at those times that we're grasping and we're saying, where is God? And what I find really comforting as I look to that holy book, to the scriptures in Christianity, is that people have been asking those questions for all eternity. It's not just us in 2020 here, but King David, in particular, I think of in the Psalms, often crying out and asking, "Where are you, God?" And this is constantly saying, "Where are you, God?" Because in these present circumstances, I perhaps haven't come across as many hardships as others, but I certainly have had family members. The musical that I was a part of in high school had died in a car accident. She was a freshman in high school, a life taken far too soon. I looked at the way that it grieved so many of my classmates, the way that it grieved me, that this is a person we wouldn't be finishing the show with. We wouldn't be having any more conversations with. Again, just a life taken too young. And I think in those times, yes, it's going to involve the mind. You're searching for answers. You ask the questions, as we've used this acronym, ask and seek and knock. Our responsibility, just as human beings, I believe, is we ask these questions. We want to know the big question, why, and then let's seek for those answers. And I have found many of those truths to be revealed through the scriptures. So.
Cool. Can I keep you on the hot seat
and
follow up with the question
Sure.
that you posed? Because we are, I'll be honest, the last time we did this Ask Night about a month ago, I had prepared mostly for the Bible translation questions or the philosophical questions, and those are good questions. If you have them, ask them. What I was surprised to find is we had more people asking maybe heart-level questions. And I think one of those that is really present right now, Justin, is how could there be a good God when I just see a mess? Singular God, now we're talking about Islam, Judaism, Christianity. So even just the question, is God good, is starting to go towards just a handful of faith systems. But as we look at the corruption, it doesn't really matter if you're blue or red, you believe there's significant corruption. So we all agree on that at the very least.
Yeah, so it's a heavy question. There's a lot of layers to it, so I'll start off and then maybe you guys want to jump in on evil in this world. as you're red or blue, where your political identities are, that you see that there is corruptions. We do see that this world is imperfect. Okay, that it's filled with imperfect people. I'm imperfect, and you gentlemen are imperfect, and we're all imperfect.
Which one of us is the most imperfect?
Yeah, I'll take that one. I'll take the most imperfect.
False humility.
But no, that's one of the realizations that we come to in Christianity, that if we're gonna get anywhere towards and that those imperfections hurt not only ourselves, but they hurt other individuals. And so they're, violence and corruption, and even thinking about things like natural disasters are really a result of living in an imperfect world, of a creation that was created to be good, but that through sin, through disobedience towards God, everything has been tainted. God's goodness then, in that sense, I believe is elevated when there's a distinction.
So your first part of the answer to the question is that we're going to not place the blame for the evil on God. That the blame actually falls on the fault of humanity.
Yeah, so let me add on to that for a moment, because I want to speak to how...
starting...
I want to speak to God's goodness in that when God created human beings, in his goodness, he gave us the ability to make choice. He gave us what we call free will. That's part of God's goodness, to do that. But it also has led to bad decision-making on our part, which is our human responsibility for, for the imperfection that's in the world.
Which for anyone that's watching and it's like, man, I've been here for 5 minutes and we're already on the sin topic. I think we can all understand the category distinctions of when people are given the free rein to make the choices that they desire to make. Quite often those choices aren't exercise habits. You think about someone's media consumption. You think about someone's work ethic. So often we make choices because of our ability that aren't good. And so when you combine those all the way up, it does sound a lot like sin.
Yeah, let me give you an example of that's one of the most convicting to me is in the way that I can be agitated by something that my children do. And 9 times out of 10, I would like to be doing in a moment, and so then I can have anger well up in me, and So
one of the answers, and Sarah, do we have questions on the live chat? Okay, so if you'll grab one for us in just a second, I think one of the first things you say there, Justin, is how can God be good and there be all this evil? Essentially, the simplified question, and one of the answers is, the fault of the evil doesn't totally rely on the creator. It relies on the creation. And I think that's a big distinction that separates Christianity from other religions is we got the fault. And that's a hard one. I think it's a big one.
And it is one of the answers. As I said, there are layers to this.
That's a big question.
I believe that it also creates a distinction between God and his goodness. When you can see the whole picture, God is more good. He's greater good when you see it in the comparison.
Sure.
Which is why oftentimes, before we get to the serious question, oftentimes we, everybody thinks in terms of a good and evil. I think, and it's because that comparison factor makes. This is how we know it's good because it's not the evil, and this is how we know it's evil because it's not the good. We create these different standards. So,
Sarah, what do we have online?
That God takes people when he will.
Oh, yes. Sorry. We said because it was a good question.
Yes. There's no microphone up here. So
the question was, Justin, why did you use the phrase, a life taken too soon, when you, the person would assume, believe that God is perfect in his timing, takes lives when they're supposed to be taken?
Sure. So the second, what gives me comfort in knowing that, but there's still the reality of knowing that this individual never got to experience driving a car. going to their senior prom, getting married. There's a lot of blessings and joys in, as I knew this individual, she was a believer, and that also brought a lot of great encouragement to me that what she's going to experience earlier than I get to experience with God the Father is going to far surpass an experience I had in my senior prom. Or
Life taken too soon is saying something from an earthly perspective. I think anytime you see something and your heart says, that's not supposed to happen. Car crash, someone dies.
Yep.
Sickness, someone dies. Miscarriage. Something in you that screams, whether internally or externally, that's not supposed to happen.
Exactly.
And that is not a dig on God's ability to take life, what he does. It's a dig on saying the creation that we experience is not perfect. The creation we experience is not whole, it's not finished, it's not totally good, and that's why we're experiencing things that make us say, there's not supposed to be divorce.
Correct.
There's not supposed to be miscarriage. And it's those heart cries from our human perspective that make us start to ask these questions. Well, why would we even think that these things are abnormal if they happen all the time? And so I think just to,
That's very good.
so Justin was answering a question with both a God theological lens and an earthly human experience
Correct.
lens at the same time.
correct.
Anything else, Sarah?
This is going back to free will.
Yeah.
So why did or would God create the world if even before he created it, he knew everything that was going to happen? And then now when we talk about it, we blame it on sin. How is that free will?
Okay, so the question, God, if the God of the scriptures is true, then he knows everything that's going to happen before it happens. And that God would then know, God then created the creation that he knew would fail. Why do we then blame it on sin and not God? I think that's where
Sounds
we're
about
getting.
right.
That's
Yeah.
a great question.
Okay, so
Yeah.
if God knows what he's doing, he knows the world's going to fail, be broken, have.
Yeah.
I
So
knew I
let's-
was setting that one up so that one of you
Yeah.
two gentlemen could answer it.
So when I was in seminary, one of my professors, the question of free will is a very loaded one. And it's not just in Christian theological circles, okay? Because even in naturalism, you have the idea of determinism, okay? So if you talk to somebody who's is the setting in motion of all things at whatever point in time people say things were set into motion, is everything determined on a linear scale? Like we're stretching out, nothing is going to change, or are there possible worlds, parallels, whatever, that kind of thing? We're not going to talk about that because that's not, within Christian circles, we would say there's one world. There's one God who created that one world, and he created it for a purpose. And within Christianity, our trust and our belief is that God does everything he does to glorify him. So how this is going to feed into the question, basically when we think, why would God set things up? Why would God even create anything? This draws us into an understanding, I think, that gives us some perspective of who God is, because God, it's popular to think of God as being this lonely character who exists outside of time, and he comes to this point where he realizes, I'd really like something to do, a hobby. Or people. Let's create people that I can have relationships with. Well, the problem with that is that it's assuming deficiencies about God. Okay, and this I promise is going to get. We begin with this starting point of thinking about God as we would think about ourselves. So if I'm off on an island somewhere, let's say you've seen the movie Castaway, Tom Hanks, he gets really crazy and he takes his volleyball and creates this character, Wilson. And I think sometimes people, the Christian perspective though, in understanding who God is and the character of God is to say, God needs nobody outside of himself. So when he brought the world into being, it was this magnificent display of creative glory. a magnificent display of power that is not raw power, but beautiful power, of good power. And so as you read through the first couple chapters of the Bible, you see a God who says, after he creates each thing on each day, he says that it was good. So he pronounces goodness over his creation. And we take a step back and we think, God is creating these things and he's seeing what he has done, and he looks at it and he says, this is good. And it's good because his hand is on it. His handprints, his fingerprints are all over this created order. And so we think, why did God create everything? First of all, God created everything because he desired to create. And he created not out of a deficit. He created out of a spot of overflow, where it's like, I so deeply desire to show beings who can experience and enjoy who I am, exactly who I am. And
It's kind of akin to an artist creating art, not for the purpose of selling it, not for the purpose of giving it, not for the purpose of having an identity, but just because there's something in the artist that needs to express the art.
Yeah. And so,
and even that, I said needs, you said, so even sometimes we get terse theological language.
So when we look at that, we understand God creating everything as he did. We have to take that and understand that God created everything in goodness. So God created everything in goodness. Now, we think, okay, he's at the beginning and he sees to the end, and we think, okay, well, if he sees it's all going to mess up, why does he go ahead and do this anyways? And because there are a couple of questions that are worked in here. The question of, well, if everything's determined from the beginning to the end, why did he even do it? Because some people would say, well, if God saw that we were going to blow it, well, why did he bring himself heartache? Okay, you look in the first, Genesis chapter 6, you see God grieved. It says, Moses, who records this, that God is grieved in his heart over his creation of man. Now, does that mean that God didn't see it coming? Absolutely not. It just means that we get a glimpse of how God's heart relates to humanity, of how God's heart relates to what we do that goes contrary to what is pleasing in his sight. So there's that question about why would God do that? And then the other question is, well, why would he give us free will? And I think I'll probably tackle the free will question because I think it probably is going to make a little bit more sense in the context.
Can we pause on the free will question? Because that was a fire hose.
Yeah.
And one thing I would add as a bit of clarification, or maybe just an illustration, because one of the hearts of this question is why would God create what I think is the heart of this question. We're not trying to assume into questions, but it is a little bit difficult when we don't have dialogue to ask a follow-up.
She did. She said, basically, why would he create the opportunity for pain and suffering? That's created good and evil, and why create evil?
Yeah, that's so. What I would say is, if God only created good and evil, I need to get the question.
Yeah, let's hear that for everybody.
The clarifier was, why would he knowingly create good and evil? Why would it allow for evil in the creation? I would say if the viewpoint is that God created good and evil just because, that's a really hard pill to swallow. But if there's some reason, if there's some purpose, if there's some end goal, then maybe we can say there's a purpose for trudging through the evil that's part of creation. And as we're talking here, what I think in my mind is, if you're a parent, there are certain things. It's not a perfect analogy, but if you think about. A good parent is not going to allow a kid underneath the sink to eat cleaning supplies, but might allow them to eat something that doesn't taste good, like dirt. The parent could follow the kid around all of their life, making sure the kid never eats dirt, protecting from every angle, but eventually there is some way in which the child needs to learn that what they're doing is not helpful. In the same way that my mom was a very loving mom. She was a very active mom. She always did everything for me, which meant I got to a point in college where I was a college student and she was still filling out forms for me and making sure my bills were paid and all these things. And at one point I said, Mom, I need you to let me fail so that I can learn from the failure. And I would say it's not a perfect analogy, but if we're looking at God's creation, a parent letting their child to some extent fail in order that they might grow through the failure, you would say, okay, well, the parent's not just letting them fail because they're a bad parent. The parent has a higher goal at the end of the failure. And so if God has a higher goal at the end of creation, and that is, the Christian scriptures would say, that is to show his might and his glory. And so Chris has told us that in creation, God displays his creativity, God displays his wonder and his majesty and his beauty, what the scriptures call his glory. And then his ultimate end is to once again display his glory. And so as we're looking at why is evil present, the biblical answer is when God went to create the world, knowing what would happen, he determined that it would be worthwhile to show his majesty through glory, or show his glory through evil and suffering, by bringing people out of that evil and suffering, by at the end of time ending evil and suffering. Now, that still leaves us to say, that's still just the Christian answer. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, every single worldview has to answer for evil. Mm-hmm. A worldview that doesn't believe in God has to say, how do I know there's evil at all? Yeah. A worldview that believes in a different God has to say, well, how does God interact with evil? And so the Christian answer is God allowed for evil because he knew that the end goal, the end game of displaying his glory by paying for sin in Jesus Christ at the cross and ultimately bringing people who were sinful back to him, that would be worthwhile.
Can I cap that with an additional illustration, because you liken God to an artist, and so you can think about a blank canvas that the artist paints on, and it's good, it's beautiful, it's a great picture, and then you add randomness to this. You cover up what looked to be good, but then in this painting there is a design that you don't know. There's a stencil to this, that as that stencil is removed, it creates an even greater picture. So all part of the artist's design, his plan for it. So.
Let me pick up as well on the idea of parenthood and how that plays into this as well, because as a dad of 6 kids, I love my kids.
Still just
dearly.
6. Did you check before you came here?
Haven't checked in 24 hours, but we're still at 6 as far as I know. So when I think about my children, I'm a very sentimental person. Memories are important to me. I love making memories with my kids, and I'm fiercely protective of my children. Fiercely protective. If somebody wants to draw my ire, threaten my children, and you'll see a very unhappy camper. Now, that being said, when it comes to how I, as a parent, when I think about my children coming into this world, my eldest is 12, my youngest is 4 months, and as my children have come into the world, I've had to come to terms with something, and I've had to come to terms with the fact that they will die. And that might sound like a pretty, well, of course they're going to die, but when you're a parent and you realize that this little being, every beat of their heart, from the first ultrasound you get, where you see their heart beating, you hear it in this ultrasound monitor, and it is so beautiful. You realize every heartbeat is another heartbeat closer to it stopping. And so, as a dad, do I think, is it worth it to have children? There's the adage, "'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all." And as a parent, when I think about how I relate to my children, I would rather that my children come to this world knowing, one of my children sliced their foot open today on a razor that was in the shower. She was in a lot of pain, and it was awful. I don't like seeing my children in pain, but would I rather that they not exist just because they can avoid pain? And for me as a father, I think there's a lot more to life than pain. And I think for a lot of people, we experience, varying degrees of pain. There's some people who experience a lot more pain than others, and so there's a lot of heartache that can load a question like that when people think, why would God create me knowing that I would suffer like this? Okay? And I think the older that you get, the longer that you live, the more opportunities you've had to compile a list of grievances, if you will, against the God who made you. Because you think, well, if I weren't alive, then ... fill in the blanks with whatever it is that you're not enjoying at the moment. But I would say, as a father, when I look at my children, I hate the fact that they hurt. I hate the fact that they suffer. But would I rather say, I'd rather not be a father at all. I'd rather they not exist at all.
Good.
And so looking at how God relates to his creation, I would simply say, there is something better about humanity existing than not existing. And even if pain and suffering are part of the equation, which, as Justin spoke of earlier, I mean, we've messed this up. We've messed this up. I think we can see pretty clearly over the course of human history that we make bad decisions, and our bad decisions hurt other people on a regular basis. Some bad decisions are huge bad decisions. Others are regular, daily bad decisions. But really, at the end of the day, to think we've messed this up, but God created us for something more, to your point. There's something more than just our experience of pain, our experience of suffering. And I'd love to talk about that a little more, but we'll get to that.
So there's
later.
two answers in there. One is, mine was, there's an end game from God's perspective of displaying something about himself, and yours was, there's something beautiful. And I think we would, anyone who's in a relationship with someone they love, brotherhood, marriage, friendship, whatever it may be, like, you see the beauty in humanity. And so I really appreciate that answer, Chris, is there's the creation of humanity and this world as one to be enjoyed and to be appreciated in and of itself is a worthwhile endeavor. We did have, let's pause on the free will question. I want to see if we have anything else, because we can always come back to free will.
Can we?
Yeah, we're tackling a huge creation sin. I mean, this is, so thank you for the follow-up questions.
Yes.
This one's going to be a nice fun one too. Basically, kind of continuing to follow up is that if he created us, like he created some who, like basically when he created us, did he already create people deciding who would be saved and damned? And then, like basically, like I feel like this is kind of just a statement along with it.
Okay, so the first question was, if God created us, when he created us, did he decide who would be saved and who would not be saved?
Yeah.
And the other question is,
Well, it's just kind of a statement, like I almost feel like I wouldn't have my son if I knew ahead of time that he would be condemned. Kind of follow up to what Chris was saying when he was talking about his children.
okay. So first question is, when God creates, does he determine ahead of time who would be saved and who would be condemned? And the follow-up statement is, if I knew that God would condemn my child, then I wouldn't have the child, as Chris said. So those are two big ones. Chris, do you want to start us off here?
Yeah. So, this topic, and for us, and the perspective we come from, and what we'd say, what the Christian Bible has to say is that it's unapologetic about the fact that the God who is a God who rules over every molecule in this universe. And it's hard for us to swallow that at times because we do see things that we don't like, okay? And the further up it moves the ladder from preference issues to deep heartbreak, deep heartache, the more we're prone to look at God and say there's fault. The more we're prone to look at him and say there's something wrong. And so when it comes to how we understand that, how does God work with human beings in terms of holding people accountable when he determines, well, this person will be condemned, this person will not. It's easy for people to think about that in very mechanical terms, as though somehow there's this kind of this heavenly lottery system where it's like, oh, okay, well, there's Justin, good for you, Justin. And poor Bob is just out of luck. And there's this interesting dynamic that exists. And if you read the Gospel of John, you read John, who is this great, dear, personal friend of Jesus as Jesus walked this earth. You find John recording some very interesting statements that Jesus makes about this type of issue. Because Jesus says plainly, he said, nobody can come to me unless my Father grips him, grabs him, brings him in. Okay? So that sounds an awful lot like, well, God is completely in charge of this. And at the same time, Jesus makes statements saying, if you're thirsty, come to me. And if you come to me, I'm never going to cast you out. I'm never going to cast you out. And you know, peeling back layers here, there's a lot that can be said about, well, how are we held accountable for our actions if God is determined, et cetera, et cetera. And you know, again, this is one of those spots where it's such a deep question, such a big question, that it would be great to have the coffee shop conversation. It'd be really great to have that and ask digging questions like, what do you think about this?
And as you say that, if anyone would like to have further conversation, my email is pastorjosh@downtomissionchurch.com, and then we have similar ones, Pastor Chris at downtomissionchurch.com, Pastor Justin at downtomissionchurch.com. So Justin's in Merrill, Chris is in Stevens Point, I'm in Wausau. If you're looking for deeper follow-up question and we just didn't actually get to what you said, please email us. It would be great to hear personally.
Yeah, we'd love to. We'd love to. So, excuse me, when it comes to understanding these dynamics, there is this big behind-the-scenes thing that goes on that I think we want to get answers about things that we have no ability to comprehend, okay? We want to say, well, God, why did you not do this? And in the case of somebody who, you know, you think, well, my child, okay? I mean, again, I've got 6 kids. They're going to make decisions in life. And I wish, and I'm definitely a helicopter dad, I wish I could be there to kind of hold their hands to make the right decisions the whole time. But I can't do that. I can't do that. And do I pray all the time that my children would come to know Jesus? I absolutely do. I absolutely do. But do I know? Do I know without a shadow of a doubt that each of my children is going to be among these people that we're talking about here, those that have been chosen by God for salvation? And really, it may be unsatisfying to hear, but I think this is kind of one of those spots where we have to be willing to hold some of our judgment back when it comes to the purposes of God, because the promise stands that anybody who will see their need for a Savior, anybody who will see their need to be made anew and to be made right with the God that created them and that they know they've sinned against, but they have no idea how to be made whole with Him. The promise of the Bible, the promise of Jesus to people is that if you find yourself in that spot, come. Like, come. And at the same time, there's also this reality, and it sits in a heavy way, I think, for us, especially when we think about people that we know that are not taking up this offer, as it were, that are not coming to Jesus. And it is a reality that God is doing things that we don't understand. And furthermore, I think for us to kind of come to a point where we have to stop our mouth and realize God doesn't owe us an explanation for everything. You know, and that is
there can be some
hard
people
to
really
hear.
unsatisfied.
Yeah, there will be,
and that's okay.
You know, but I would say even as a dad, do I tell my children why I do everything I do? I don't. No. And when it comes to the God of the universe, does He owe us an explanation? The answer is no. He doesn't owe us an explanation. But if you will see Him for who He is, and this is kind of what we want people to be able to do, is to see God for who He is, who He's revealed Himself to be. And I think just the plain language that Jesus communicates of, come to me, you're heavy laden with your cares and worries and all these things, come to me.
Yeah, so I think where some of these things tie together, Chris, because you're making the point that you made the point out of the Gospel of John that Jesus say you can only come in one way and only the Father brings you, and that is answering that question of, does God determine yes and no, saved or damned? But also the offer stands. So I think, holding those in tension together, what I would say is maybe an underlying part of the question, does God determine who gets saved and who gets damned, is a neutral playing field. Like, we all come out neutral. So we're on an assembly line and we're all basically beige morally. We don't have any like red or blue, red or blue, that wasn't supposed to be political, but like just different colors. So we're all beige. We all have basically the same neutral morality, and God says, okay, you're going to be good and you're going to be bad. You're going to be good and you're going to be bad. That's not the way the scriptures start the creation story.
Right.
And so the basic creation story of the scriptures, and this might lead us into why the heck should we believe the scriptures? Because a lot of the answers we're giving are based out of the Bible. And so those are really valid questions, is why would we believe that? At the end of the day, we're getting our answers from the scriptures, and the basic story is God creates good, humans corrupt good, and at that very point, God has created good, humans have corrupted good. God did not need to save anybody.
Right.
And so the scriptures say it's not that in the beginning of time God had a bunch of neutral moral agents and he just said, I would like some and I will cast some off. God created humanity. Humanity corrupted creation, therefore disrespecting, dishonoring, not being grateful to the God who created, and then God decided to save some. And so that puts it in a mercy and grace conversation, that the Lord, who did not have to do anything, did something, rather than the Lord who should have saved everybody only saved some. So those are two very different.
And I think, too, built into even that language, and it's important to understand, Christianity is what we would call a redemptive religion. Christianity is not about people improving themselves and making themselves better people and somehow recommending themselves to God on the basis of, I've done enough, or I'm a good enough person, so God, you should accept me. But the word saved is very important within Christianity, not because of what people like, be saved, a southern preacher who's yelling and sweating and everything. That's not, when we think about the word saved, when we think about salvation, baked into Christianity is this idea that everybody has a problem, and everybody needs a solution to that problem. And so fundamentally, this is an important point that you're making, Josh, that I think if somebody's going to understand who is Jesus, if somebody's going to understand what is Christianity, it's not a picture of people as being morally upwardly mobile, that we can find ourselves kind of trucking on up to a better place. But it's this I would say very bleak picture. And again, just ask yourself, you look at the world around you, do people make selfish decisions naturally or not? I've never had to teach my children to make selfish decisions. They've done that on their own. I've had to teach them to make selfless decisions because that doesn't come natural to us. So as the Bible, as Christianity assesses the picture of humanity, we're not dealing with people who are all clamoring at God's door saying, I'd really love to be in a relationship with you. In fact, we're all running away from him. And so salvation is saying, God is saying, you're headed down a path that's going to destroy you. I'm going to yank you off that path.
Yeah. And I think that's easy. Sarah, if you got a question, get ready for us. It's easy to think that, Chris, when you look out at a mass of humanity and say, yes, most of those people have a problem. Most of those people, or most of the people around me, it's harder and hardest to look inside yourself. And so I think even Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most famous atheists in world history, he was basically willing to say, yes, humanity is corrupt, but he wasn't willing to say Friedrich Nietzsche was corrupt. And that's the problem we have, is we observationally, we can look around and say, there's a real problem here, but it's much harder to look at ourselves or our families even, or our close friends, and to get to that point.
I just want to address that individual that asked the question, because he or she said that, had I known this about my son, maybe this is a wayward child, that I wouldn't have had this son. And to that, I just want to say, in the answers that you've heard here, I hope some of it you've heard too, is that we don't know. Right. This is beyond our mind of whom God has brought to redemption and whom will remain wayward. And so my encouragement to you is that we should never say of ourselves or of somebody else that all hope is lost, because God is the God of the impossible. He does what is impossible for man, and he can redeem even the most wayward and vilest of individuals, and he has and will continue to do so. And on the flip side of that, there is an aspect that none of us should say of ourselves or of somebody else that they are totally gold and they are good to go, absolutely, unequivocally. I know it, 110%, in a prideful arrogance type of a way, as if it rests upon themselves, that's why they will be redeemed by God, because God will choose whom he'll choose, and it is God's work. So what is impossible
humility
for man is possible for God. And so I highlight the two parts to that it is possible for God, and also knowing that it is God who does the work. So it should bring about a humility to even the most upright, moral individual that we know, that if that person is being redeemed, it's because of a work that God is doing in their life. It must be God's work. So
thanks, Justin. Sarah, what do we have?
And to follow up on that, she's like, I'm not sure we're getting to the heart of my question. She's probably going to reach out to her.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And so I want to jump way back. This is from a Christian, it sounds. As a non-denominational Christian, and we're supposed to be equally yoked with others, like, is dating a Catholic considered equally yoked? We're gonna pause on that question. Do we have any? I would like to maybe get another. It seems like a lot of the questions we're asking might be from within the faith. So do we have any that seem that they're from without the faith, and then we can? We have, why do you assume that a perfect God exists without relationship? Why do you assume that self-sufficiency is inherently good, that the perfect form of God does not include the need for relationship?
Okay, so the question is, why do we assume that a perfect God exists without a need for relationship? Why do we assume that self-sufficiency is the descriptor of perfection? Why can God not be perfect and need something?
I would love to answer that question.
Yeah?
I would love to answer that. So, unique within, so throughout world religions, you have varying levels of who is God, who are the gods that exist, that kind of a thing. And within certain religious systems, you have what's called polytheism. So you have a plurality of gods. You have multiple gods who exist. One may not be necessarily supreme. One may have certain faults, that type of thing. And then you have monotheism. Monotheism, the idea there's one God. Unique to Christianity is the concept, the truth, that God has always existed in relationship. There's a word that, if you've grown up in the church, you've been around the church at all, you hear the word Trinity. Trinity College exists, and a lot of Trinity colleges exist around the world. And what does that mean? Well, what that means is that there is something very, and it's unparalleled. We can't come up with the perfect analogy for what this looks like in our lives, because it is unique to God, in that the Bible speaks of one God Okay, so early on in the Bible, one of the most fundamental phrases of the Old Testament is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Okay, that's called the Shema. That's a phrase that was repeated over and over throughout the Old Testament. The people were to repeat that regularly. And yet, you have these hints throughout the Old Testament, and then coming to a fuller picture in the New Testament of the fact that God being one does not necessarily mean that he is alone, but that this one God consists of three persons. And so you have, with this one God, you have the person of the Father, and the person of the Son, and the person of the Holy Spirit. And the really beautiful thing, and I appreciate the question a lot, because sometimes there's this, I would say, a stoicism that people project onto Christianity and think, kind of the stiff upper lip, relationships don't matter, it's just, you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that kind of a thing. And yet the picture of the God who is revealed in the Scriptures is of a God who has always and eternally enjoyed his own communion. So the Father has, when Jesus speaks of his relationship with the Father, he says, glorify me with the glory with which I was glorified with you before everything existed. So you see this relationship between the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And so I would say that there is nothing within Christianity, within biblical Christianity, that says that the self-sufficiency of God is a relational self-sufficiency. In fact, God is in community for all of eternity. And when he creates us, then we're created as relational beings. So I think nobody wants to be in solitary confinement, because God created us as relational beings because he's relational. So I hope that gives some perspective there.
So that's a good biblical answer of the Trinity and what the Trinity is. I think maybe more from the philosophical / just the idea of self-sufficiency. We might look at self-sufficiency and say, generally someone who's self-sufficient is just denying that they need help even though they need help. Like, that person's self-reliant. Sure. Well, they're really they don't want to ask for help. Sarah Gooden, our assistant who is giving us these questions, her husband is self-sufficient. He never asks for help. It's actually a flaw. We love you, Corey, but ask for help more often. And so within that, it's like, well, there's an idea of self-sufficiency. When we think about God, let's take maybe the God of Islam as an example. So the God of Islam is described as a God of love, in the same way that the God of the Hebrew Bible and the God of the Christian Bible, all monotheistic gods, all gods of love. Now, we think, what is love? Well, love is something that is displayed from one to another. Mm-hmm. And so for God to be a God of love, there needs to be the display of love. Because without the display of love, you have to love someone or something. So where one of the problems that Islam runs into is that it says God has been eternally loving, but then you ask the question, what did that singular God love before creation? And the answer is there was nothing to love. Now, the same question gets asked of Christianity, and the answer is the singular God is made up of three persons that loved one another. And so that is the way in which something like love was able to exist prior to creation. Because if it wasn't, then what we have to say is God created the world because he had a lack in something, because he needed something. And therefore, God is now dependent on us, and we get to run part of the show. And so that's why the idea of self-sufficiency is important, is because we're talking about an eternal being, a being that claims that they cannot change, a being that claims that they don't give the glory, that the Lord does not give the glory away. And so when we talk about self-sufficiency, we're saying he doesn't lack anything. He doesn't lack anything. From all of eternity, he had happiness. For all of eternity, he had love, he had power, he didn't need anything from us, and that's pivotal to the story of creation, and that's why I think we're going to, plant a flag on the self-sufficiency of God. Sarah, what's next? We'll get to so one of the questions we skimmed over earlier, stay with us if you're with us, it was about dating if you're a non-denominational Christian, if you're dating someone who's Catholic. That's a good question. Stay tuned. I want to jump back to, we've got about half an hour left. We talked about free will earlier, and that's an interesting conversation to have because that's a conversation that is, it's hotly debated within the Christian faith. It's also hotly debated outside of the Christian faith. And the idea is, what is free will? And is that free will totally free, or do we have some maybe strings attached to the free will? Justin, do you have any thoughts on free will? I just wanted to give you a chance with the mic. If not, we can.
Yeah, briefly to answer those things, my typical response is. Yes, it feels perfectly free to us.
Yeah.
But theologically, knowing that God is in control, it can't possibly be 100% free, because he can't have 100% control if we have this freedom either. That's a competing claim there. So, but I don't think that diminishes our free will in any way. It's just it's a mystery, and part of that mystery is what our minds can. We do not have that same mind that God has. We have limited capabilities, or else we ourselves would be God. Again, distinction is really important. That there are things that we will never, achieve to being that keeps God separate from all of humanity, and so. In our minds, I don't think we should spend too much time saying, well, then it's not really free if he knows this or that, if he controls this or that, because it is indeed free in our limited capacity.
Your pivot or your pivotal point is the experience of the choice is free.
Yeah.
And I think one of the questions that always comes to my mind is, and there's probably someone who's much smarter than me that's going to be like, that's a bad analogy. But we are not totally free to do anything.
Correct.
So take God out of the equation.
Right.
Let's say there is no God. Let's take God completely out of the equation. I am not free to jump from the top of the Stevens Point Church and not fall. Like, if I jump, I will fall, or I'll have to grab onto something else.
Law of gravity.
I'm just, but bound by nature to certain things. I am not free to jump as high as I would like. I'm not free to jump without falling. There is a law of nature. Now, I can still jump. I can still make the choice, but I'm not totally free in that choice. And I think that's one of the things that helps me is in relation to how could God create humanity and have his, as the scriptures would say, have his hand on things. And also we have choice is similar to, like, I can choose to jump, but I don't have total free enterprise over what happens. In the basic, the old theologian term would be agency, is that God has ultimate agency over what happens, and we have been given what's called proximate agency, in the same way that if you're a parent and you have ultimate control over the finances, you might give out some money to your children to complete certain tasks, and they might have proximate agency over whether or not that task gets completed with the money given. If you give them $100 for groceries, they could spend it on eating out, or they could spend it on, like, lottery tickets. They have a little bit of agency, but you still have ultimate agency, and that's how I would look at that question. Chris, any thoughts on free will?
Yeah, will gets talked about a lot, and people want him free apparently, but
that was a joke.
It was a joke.
He's not very
sorry,
funny though.
I'm a dad, but with the issue of free will, I guess there are a couple different avenues that just kind of to think through it and to think through how does free will operate? Because I think for us, sometimes we can be too smart for our own good, and we can think through scenarios and think through hypotheticals in ways that actually are not even real. Okay, and so let me explain that. In the issue of the will, it's common to think, well, I could make this choice and I could make that choice, and that is true. Okay, you could. Right now, I could make the choice to remain on stage, or I could make the choice to run off screaming, hop in my truck, and start crying on my way home because I feel awful about, could I do that?
Should we do a poll on YouTube and find out what they
poll.
want?
I would like to see that. Is that something I could choose? Yeah, I could choose to do that. Now, is the likelihood of that very high? Absolutely not. So when it comes to making a choice, we can choose to do certain things. But even on a purely philosophical, on a purely, this is where, in contemporary physics and Neil deGrasse Tyson and all these types of guys talk about parallel universes, okay? And it sounds like science fiction stuff, and I would say it is science fiction stuff, but it's one of the ways that people are trying to merge philosophy with physics because they think, okay, well, the idea of the parallel universe and infinite parallels and that kind of a thing, because if there is a choice to be made here, there's a choice to be made opposite here. And so for a world to be truly free, the ability to make those choices has to exist on every plane. So it's like, so there's this infinitely parallel universe theory that kind of exists in the world of physical philosophy, we'll call it that. I would say that that's not accurate and not helpful. It's one of those, I think we're too smart for our own good when we think that way, because we may want to think that way to make allowances for the idea of what we'll say is our ability to choose. But at the end of the day, if we think about this, we think, I'm going to make a choice right now that I can't unmake, okay? The fact that I'm staying right here right now means I did not run out to my truck.
Sure.
And so when we think about how does the will play out, the reality is we are going to make at any given point a choice to do something, and we will have made the choice to not do any other number of things that we did not do. And so on a purely volitional, there's your fancy term, volitional basis, we are willing to do one thing that happens. And our lives are basically this succession of moments, a succession of choices that we are constantly making, and we cannot unmake them. We cannot go back and unmake them. Now, is it possible that when we made that choice, another choice could have been made? Absolutely. We could have done that. We could have made that other choice, but the fact remains that we did not. Now, how does that factor into theology? How does it factor into the Christian understanding of the will? Well, the Christian would say, as we would say right here, is we would say, we make choices. We make choices to do certain things. And those choices that we make have consequences. Mm-hmm. The choices that we make have real consequences. And when it comes down to it, beyond the volitional, beyond the I just make a choice to do this, it is the I make a choice to do this because. And this is where it gets uniquely Christian, because within Christianity, the idea of accountability for heart-level decisions is absolutely crucial. And so we're held accountable because we actually want to do the things we do. At the end of the day, sometimes we talk about free will, we think that God is twisting our arm to do certain things, but the reality
because
is...
Because the assumption is, if God does control all things, then I can't be held accountable. But you make a really good point, Chris, is we do the things we want to do.
Right. Yes.
And if you're saying, no, I do not do the things, that sounded like really petty. If you're saying, no, I don't generally, like I would love to quit my job, but I don't, then the answer is you would rather keep your job and make money than you would quit. So we're always balancing wants and desires, and we generally, almost always, do the thing we want to do, whether it's protecting ourselves or spending what we want to spend, we act upon our own desire. And so even within Christianity, the Bible is saying, we can't understand how, but God controls all things, and we make real choices with real consequences.
Here's the analogy that I was thinking of when the night first opened, and the idea that one of my seminary professors said, best way he could picture it is how an author writes a book. Okay, so if you are J.R.R. Tolkien, you're writing The Lord of the Rings, you write all these characters, okay? And these characters get written into into being, into existence. And you know, if you've read the books, watched the movies, they're compelling characters, and you're thinking as you go through, like, what is so-and-so going to do? What's going to happen with this character? Well, Tolkien determined that. Tolkien wrote it out, but you're not thinking as you're reading this book, like, oh, if Frodo decides to just run off with the ring, you know, it's going to upset Tolkien. Like, no. Frodo makes decisions to carry the ring into Mordor, into Mount Doom. He makes that decision as the character. Nobody's sitting there saying, oh, Tolkien is forcing Frodo to do that. And yet Tolkien's responsible for the work. Sure. He's responsible for the book. Nobody's going to charge Tolkien with saying, oh, you know what, that character's responsibility, his decisions, it's on you. It is, to a degree, because he wrote the story, but we don't hold the author responsible for the actions of the character. We understand he wrote it and that it wouldn't exist apart from that author, but at the end of the day, we see the character just the same way that our agency we're seeing for what
It's really good. It's a really good analogy. Sarah, do we have anything else that's coming through? I do have a question for Justin while you look. The question, Justin, we're going back to the dating question.
Oh, boy.
Someone said from a non-denominational, so if you're not familiar with what non-denominational means, you've got Baptist, you've got Presbyterian, you've got Methodist, you've got Episcopalian. These are historic denominations. They're groups of churches that make decisions based on church leadership and baptism and the way that they order services. Non-denominational is a fairly new one that is, it tends to try to be more wide-reaching. It has less distinctives. So in a non-denominational, this person is saying, I go to a non-denominational church, I think, is it appropriate to date someone from the Catholic Church? So that would be a different, Catholics might not like me saying this, but a different denomination. Justin, your thoughts?
I'm going to start with the groundwork that I think the place that this person is asking that from perhaps is coming from the scriptural command to not be unequally yoked.
Yes.
What does that mean, Justin?
Yeah, exactly. So to be unequally yoked is essentially for a believer, for one who has put their faith and their trust in Jesus Christ for salvation, that then calls God their Father, that is welcomed into the family of God, to be dating outside of the family of God, to be dating one that would be considered a non-believer. So, you know, and one of the best ways I've heard this put, as you think of dating and how it leads into marriage, and that leads into then that family becoming your family. If you are a child of God, the unbeliever is part of the world. The devil is the prince of this world. You're kind of within that family system is kind of the separation there. So do you want to marry into a family where the devil becomes your father-in-law? Not a great situation. Not a good option, right?
Pastor Justin at downtownmissionchurch.com. Pastor Justin.
So, yep.
Yeah. So at the heart of what you're saying here, Justin, is the non-denominational Catholic distinction is not the most helpful distinction in the same way that the Baptist Presbyterian distinction would be. It's do you place your life, trust, faith in Jesus Christ?
Correct.
Or not?
Yeah,
and now you're going to find people in non-denominational churches that do not.
Correct.
And so just saying, well, they go to my church would not be an appropriate distinction.
So
you're going to find
I'm not
people in the
answering
Catholic
this
Church
question
that,
by saying, you know, the Catholic or the non-denominational is really the titles that we should be figuring out here,
Sure.
whether or not it's compatible, whether or not it's equally yoked, but is it believer or non-believer?
Mm-hmm.
Is it somebody that has put their faith and their trust through Jesus Christ to be welcomed into the family of God,
and in Christ alone, because that's an important distinction.
Absolutely.
Not in rituals, and I would say even within a Baptist context, people can get really excited, like, oh, you know what, I prayed this prayer when I was 5, and then I got baptized, and then I've lived the last 70 years doing math. I mean, We're not going to put our trust
Pastor
in rituals
Chris at downtownmissionchurch.com.
And the encouragement I want to give the individual that's asking this question, whomever might be asking this type of question, is rather the exhortation, the challenge is ask some hard questions. Okay, the purpose in dating relationships is to get to know the other individual, and it's a lifelong journey. Even as you go into marriage and stuff, you are continuing to know this individual more and more. That happens through our communication with one another and asking the hard questions, and that's part of why we're doing what we're doing here too. We want to have hard questions come up and answers to those questions. And I think I was a former youth pastor. I've worked with a lot of teenagers that have been in relationships that last from an hour to a week and maybe beyond that. And I'm just baffled that they just don't have conversation about, especially if for you, if God is really important to you, then you should be asking questions to determine whether or not this individual you're in a dating relationship with, that's important to them. Don't put it way down on the list of, well, what's their favorite candy bar? Is it the same as mine? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about equally yoked. Okay, we're not talking about just preferences and personalities that mesh together, but the most important thing, because this is we've talked about that there's a Christian worldview, there's a non-Christian worldview. You don't want to bring those two worldviews together. They're not going to mesh together.
From both perspectives,
From
honestly.
both perspectives, yeah.
I mean,
it's going to be troublesome for both. So work that part out.
I know a lot of stories of families where 5, 10, 15 years into the marriage, one of the person changes religious worldviews and becomes a Christian, and there's conflict because the other person's like, whoa, I didn't sign up for this. Right. I didn't sign up for Sunday services. And so I think one thing that's lost, because even in telling someone, hey, you should only date, if you're a Christian, you should only date a Christian. If you believe in Jesus for the salvation of your sins and he is the Lord over your life, you should only date someone else who says the same things. That's not a very attractive thing to say right now, but we want to be honest in saying if you actually believe Jesus is the Lord over your life, you're going to live in a certain way and make decisions in a certain way. You're going to make financial decisions in a certain way. You're going to make career decisions in a certain way. You're going to make decisions on where to live regionally in a certain way. You're going to make the types of communities you involve yourself. You're going to make so many decisions in a specific way that if you marry outside of that way, you're setting yourself up to be constantly pulled, constantly battling with someone who doesn't share the same foundation with you. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we push hard. It's not just because we're we got to keep it in the family. It's because when you actually come to Jesus, you relinquish a large measure of control over your life. And you ask Jesus, change my desires. Mm-hmm. And if you are asking Jesus to change your desires and someone else is not asking Jesus to change their desires, you're going to have different desires. Mm-hmm. And that's going to lead to a hard marriage. It looks like we've got about 10 minutes left. And did you have a question, sir?
Yeah. There is some interest in this question. One, I would like to say
my email's blowing up already, right? Phone's been going up.
Pastor Chris, some of us do hold the writer accountable.
Okay. So
some of us do hold the writer accountable.
The writer of the story.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Okay.
Some people are shaking their fist at Tolkien, saying
that's a valid response.
Yep.
So there's interest in are some people called to be single for life?
The Apostle Paul was. Jesus
Let's
was.
restate the question, if you would, for everybody. Yeah.
The answer to every question is
the
Jesus.
answer is Jesus, and the question was...
The question is, are some people called to be single for life? The Apostle Paul was single. Jesus was single. So the number, I'll reorder them into Jesus and the Apostle Paul. Number 1 and number 2 in the Christian faith, both were single, and they were single for the purpose of ministry. And they were single for the purpose of glorifying the Lord. And they were... I think you have this question of if God does call you to be single for life, it is likely that he is trying to show you his satisfaction in you in a way that, and I explain it this way, I'm going to go home after this to my wife, and I'm going to get a certain level of relational satisfaction from her. She's going to ask how my day was. I'm going to ask how her day was. If my day was bad, if I say I really sounded like a dodo on this Ask Night thing and I'm struggling, because she's going to say, okay, well, we're going to have a relational satisfaction. If you're single, you don't get that as much, and you then have to get that from the Lord. Mm-hmm. And therefore, and this is not just a pat Christian answer, but single folks get to experience the Lord in a unique way because they are relying on him as a husband. They're relying on him as the one who constantly gives his ear to their prayers. They're relying on him. As people who are married, we can kind of neglect the Lord and just go to our wives sometimes and not experience him in that way. So I would say quick answer, some people are. I don't know how many people, and if you are, it's probably for the purpose of ministering for the Lord or finding your satisfaction in the Lord above all else.
And you did mention Paul as having a call to singleness. He writes of it in 1 Corinthians very highly, thinks of a life of singleness. I know the question was, does God call people single for life? But I'll start by saying God calls all of us to be single at some point. Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually, I'm very passionate about people understanding that, as so often we look to dating, relationships, and marriage for that satisfaction, mm-hmm. as you said, Josh. And so everybody needs to learn mm-hmm. what it means to be single and to find that singular satisfaction in our relationship with God, mm-hmm. in order to also then be better, in our dating relationships, better boyfriends, girlfriends, fiancés, husbands, wives. And I think just a personal opinion of mine, I don't think that singleness is spoken enough about in the American church, that it's not spoken highly enough about.
Singleness is not a problem to overcome.
Yeah,
it is a stage of life.
Yeah,
and if it is a stage longer for some than for others. But you're correct. We tend to speak of marriage as the ultimate end of the Christian faith. Like that's how you'll know when you're.
And we have,
even though it's not true.
We can have men's young adult ministries and things like that can almost seem to be more aimed at trying to pair individuals up, matchmaking services. Exactly. That's a disservice to, because
the reality is that understanding that God being the one who created us out of his fullness to enjoy him, to glorify him, we're not going to find salvation on any level from another person.
Yep.
We're not going to find relational salvation from another person. And the reason being is because every person you encounter, as wonderful as they may seem right away, because we always put our best feet forward, that person will fail you. I failed my wife countless times. Justin's failed his wife countless times. Josh has failed his wife 2 or 3 times.
But who's done it more? Are we back to that question?
Who's done it more? Yeah, I will take that one. But, we fail people that we love, and the people we love fail us. And so when it comes to understanding singleness, sometimes I would say people look at singleness as being this intense virtue. I remember when I was like 21, it was like there were this group of guys that we were friends. We were all in a Christian campus ministry, and like, yeah, singleness is the best until you get a girlfriend, and then you're like, see you later, guys. So singleness is not a virtue in and of itself, but it is something that we need to see what is God's design for. Mm-hmm. Just like what is God's design for marriage, because, if you're married, you or your spouse will die before the other one. Is that person's life over them because you have died? Or is your life over because they've died? The answer is no. But, just as the, Solomon writes in Ecclesiastes, to everything there is a season under heaven. And so your life may be marked by a long season of marriage to a person that will give you great satisfaction, but will also annoy the pants off you and make you feel miserable at times because you have competing desires. They're butting up against each other. And you may have seasons of wonderful singleness where you are just enjoying God's companionship and the companionship of other believers. So it is important to see people will always fail you. They will always fail. The greatest friend, the greatest spouse will fail. Don't put your hope in them.
Yeah, it's good. I've got one question that just keep popping in my head, so that's going to be our last question for the night. Maybe we'll just give some quick hitters. We do thank you for spending time tonight. We hope that this has been beneficial in giving you a Christian worldview lens. We've talked about a lot of things. There's a lot of things we haven't talked about. I think one that comes to mind is we've said a lot of answers from the Bible, but we haven't really talked about Bible questions. And so if any of you is thinking, okay, I know the Christian creation story, I know the Christian story of sin, I know the Christian account of Jesus, but all of this is coming from an ancient book that is really old, and I don't even know if I should believe that. Once again, our emails, Pastor Josh, Pastor Chris, Pastor Justin at downtownmissionchurch.com. Those are big questions. But the one that comes to mind over and over for me, guys, that I want to end the night with, I think it's a very, very modern question, and that is, Jesus says he's the way, the truth, and the life, and you Christians, us Christians, are saying that you should only date someone who believes that Jesus is the only way. When asked whether or not someone is in heaven or hell, earlier the answer was, well, if they believe in Jesus, he's the only way. And so we're making some pretty exclusive claims, and I think one of the questions or the statements that gets posed a lot, guys, is that it's arrogant to believe that there's only one way. And so I would like to end our night just responding to the thought that no one should say they have the only way. No one should know for sure that they are right. It's arrogant to say you've got the only truth, the only way.
Mm-hmm. Justin, you want to go first?
I'll just go right from the top of my head. The
dome.
The dome, yeah. In some ways, I think it can be foolishness to say that there are multiple ways as well. You think about a mathematical problem. 2 + 2 = 4, right? Nobody gets to say that it's anything other than 4. Mm-hmm. So there's one answer to that. There's one way to that. I think that we've talked about sin, and we've talked about the imperfection that we have. The way cannot come through any human being to be reconciled with God because of God's perfection and that distinction that it makes with us and our imperfection. That's a giant gap that needs to be covered there.
Could you say that gap one more time that needs to be covered?
The gap is sin. It's our imperfection and God's perfection, and God in his perfection cannot have fellowship, cannot be in that relationship that he desires to have. He wants that relationship. His relationship, as we alluded to earlier, that Trinitarian relationship, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, it is one of perfection. There's nothing tainted in that by sin. And he desires for human beings. He created human beings. He created them good, and he created them initially perfect before their sin, that they could be part of the relationship as well. But sin creates the gap in that relationship. And the only way that gap is closed, the only way that reconciliation is made with God, the only way that we are redeemed is for there to be God in his perfection, sending Jesus to live a perfect life, to be obedient to all of the commands that God had given that were impossible for man to do because they're imperfection, but Jesus was able to fulfill that. And then there's language through the scriptures about sacrifice. Jesus sacrifices for our sins. There must be that God is just as much as he is loving, and there needs to be a punishment for sin. Jesus takes upon that punishment himself.
So I don't know if you meant to do this, but you start off with a math equation.
Yep.
You said, when I have this plus this, it has to equal this.
Yep.
There's one way to do it. 2 + 2 = 4. And then you gave us kind of another math equation, which was when I have a moral deficit or when I have a corruption.
That's good. Yep.
And there's a just God, and I want to get to heaven. There's a certain equation here that we've got to figure out what is the one piece that satisfies the equation. And the Christian scriptures are saying there's really only one slot or one piece you can fit in that slot to say, yes, humanity's sinful, yes, justice is a thing, and yes, there's a way to heaven. And so I think that's one of the ways you look at how could Christians say it's the only way. It's saying, well,
2 plus X equals 4. There's only one number you're going to put in there.
Chris, any thoughts on Christianity being arrogant for saying it's the only way?
Yeah, I would ask the question of that individual who, may be sincerely wondering that, why is that arrogant? What is arrogant about believing in something being exclusive? What is arrogant about believing that somebody could truly, genuinely be wrong? Is that, and I think within our culture it's become so, the premium is placed on giving a sense of legitimacy to any particular sentiment or feeling or thought or idea that might be expressed because our major cultural ethic is driving the individual's self-actualization as that is the goal. All right, so all that boiling down to say, why do we need to entertain every thought and believe that that is the best possible thing for anybody to experience? Is it the best for you to find out you're right about everything? And I would say that's not good. It's not good to find out again, going back and, parenting has been something that's been so illustrative for me of God's relationship with people, because I think, man, I don't like telling my kids no. It's not, I don't sit down one day and think, oh, it's Thursday, it's time for extra no. I'm ready to dispense more no today to my kids because it's fun. Because I love my children, I have a deep desire to ensure that they understand what is good and what's right and what's true. And sometimes that means I have to correct them. It's better for somebody to find out they're wrong and to find out what the right answer is than it is for somebody to be left thinking that their incorrect answer is right until they find out experientially that it's wrong. And I would say the Christian perspective is that none of us up here have come to the conclusions of Christianity being correct because we felt that we were right and we just decided this appears to be a document that confirms everything that is good about me. In fact, the unique thing about Christianity is it says, you, me, Justin, we're rotten. And we have a problem, and we need a solution to that problem that I can't come up with on my own. And so is it arrogant to say, well, in the Christian context, I would say the most arrogant thing for us to say is that we can come up with a solution on our own to a problem we don't understand.
Sure. So we've got,
interesting.
We understand that there are math problems with only one solution. We've got, it's better for someone to realize they're wrong than to go about thinking right. And then you stole my answer at the end there. It's that baked within Christianity is a sense of humility, because an arrogant Christian is a misnomer. Within Christianity, the gospel in Ephesians 2:1-10 is you were dead, God made you alive. There's no room for arrogance there. And so I may believe wholeheartedly that I am right in saying that Jesus is the only way to salvation, but I have no room for arrogance in thinking it's because I was smart enough to get there. It was because I had studied enough. And so I can hold those at the same time. We can hold those at the same time and say there is a way. I do believe I know that way, and I only did because the Lord helped me get there. And I think that's how Christianity solves the arrogance problem. So if you're still hanging on with us just past 8 o'clock, thank you for spending some time tonight. If this was beneficial, we hope that you might send it to any friends that would have similar questions, and we're going to look at doing more nights like these in the future. Thank you to Josiah Winterhoff, who's our audio engineer, production extravaganza coordinator. He's cool. Thanks for Sarah Gooden for managing your questions and relaying them to us. Thanks to Justin and Chris for being here tonight. Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.